So thanks to our partnership with Photo Wings, we're able to offer these sessions free of charge, and also the incredible archive that we're building up. So please do take some time to go onto the 7 Interactive site and have a look at the past sessions we have, including, I think, a great one from before with Ed Kashi as well. So I think, as we say, without further ado, actually, just before I forget, Ed, I guess, will talk for 40, 45 minutes, something like that, I assume. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions. If you do have questions you want to put them into the Q&A box, and I will field them and pass them through to Ed as we go on. So Ed, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Let me just get this catalog open. For some reason, it closed while we were doing the intros. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Paul and Gianna behind the scenes for making this all happen. I just need to relaunch my Lightroom and then we can get started. It's interesting, after all these sessions, we've done so many of these online things in the last year, but I still continue to be flummoxed by Lightroom and Zoom. They do not play well together. That's what I've found. But what I want to talk about today is this idea of how, I've spent so much of my career, hold on one sec. I'm so sorry, guys. I just want to get this right. All right, there we go. Now we can do this. I spent so much of my career over the last 30, 40 years working abroad. And okay, hopefully the screen is now shared. And we have an image. But one of the things that I've also kind of prided myself in and found incredibly powerful is the ability to work locally. And the thing about working locally, and Paul, do we have an image? We're good?
Yeah, we did. You've gone, that's it. Yeah, that's full screen now. That's
okay, great. Okay, like thanks. Okay, technical hiccups are hopefully gone. So I've always found, and I think this, in some ways, this just is human nature, that the challenge of capturing the familiar, that quite often, either the people we're closest to or the sort of milieu, the environments that we know the best, are often the hardest to capture. And so working locally, or as I say, hyper locally, can really present that, sort of force you to confront that challenge, if you like. And there's also the power of just finding stories close to home. While I've worked in over 100 countries at this point, and I love working abroad, and there's also so much to learn by working locally. And during the pandemic, where we've been locked down, or at least curtailed in our ability to travel, finding stories and projects close to home is both a way to stay engaged and also a way to explore territories that we often neglect or take for granted. And again, this goes for like human relationships, how often we can take for granted the people we're closest to or the people that we're around all the time. So when you apply that idea of sort of photographic storytelling, it really, it's reflected in that way. And I'd be interested to see when we go to the Q&A, the folks who are here, is this something that you find in your own work, in your own lives, the challenge of trying to document things close to home? So I want to start with, well, also I want to say working close to home reminds me of my love for doing this work, how much there is to learn from what is right around you. And instead of traveling around the world, finding value in connecting to people and to stories locally, and also in some way, often serving your local community by doing that work. So I want to start with, I'm going to show you a selection of a handful of projects over the years, and then really focus down on a very large project that I've been working on with my wife, Julie Winokur, and Rutgers University in Newark, looking at immigration on a local level. So I'd say about 15, 16 years ago, we moved from San Francisco to New Jersey to take care of my father-in-law, Herbie. These pictures. And, you know, while I had photographed in my home before, I'd never had this challenge of trying to document not just the life of my father-in-law as he was sort of diminishing. He was 82 to 84 years old, lived the last 2 years of his life with us, but also while we were in what we call the sandwich generation, Julie and I, where we had young kids and we were sort of juggling both caring for an elder as well as taking care of young children. And this story, even to today, reverberates. We ended up doing 2 short films, working with MediaStorm and MSNBC.com to produce films and also photo essays. And even to today, we get responses from this work. And it really goes to show how so often, you know, sometimes we get to tap into sort of the universal in the stories we tell. And in this case, it was in my own home. And I have to say that I remember distinctly, this was 2006 to 2008, and I had just come back from working in India, and I needed a break from the field, quote unquote. And then I came home and I had to pick up again and immediately start working on documenting the life in my own home. So I don't know, for those of you who have either done work like this or are contemplating doing work like this, I can't express enough how powerful it is, assuming that the people you're documenting and the stories you're telling, you have their permission and their cooperation. It's really one of the most important works I've ever done. Now I want to shift to covering an event, a news event that is local. In 2012, Superstorm Sandy came and hit the New York, New Jersey area. I live just right outside of New York City in New Jersey. And this was a different kind of like local storytelling, which again has had national significance. The only global connection is this idea of climate change and global warming and the way that it seems to be creating more frequent and much more powerful storms. So one of the things that I did was I covered this for Time magazine on the day of the hurricane and then the day after. And it was pretty horrific. You know, even a neighbor a few doors down, their house was destroyed by a tree that fell on it. But then a year later, and I like to talk about this again to get you guys thinking about, you know, the ways we can create stories. So I decided, as the 1-year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy was coming, that I proposed to NBC.com to do like a 1-year later look. So this next series of diptychs are basically, I went back to the same places I had photographed when the storm hit, and then a year later I went back to the same places. So again, you know, and I know I sometimes feel that this is I don't know, one of the things about photojournalism in particular, to some degree documentary work, but really photojournalism, that we think we need to go far to tell important stories. And you know, as I want to keep on emphasizing, look locally, you know, especially during this time where it is much harder to travel. This was in Atlantic City, you know, the famous boardwalk along the shore in New Jersey had been destroyed, and a year later it had been partially replanted. You know, the beach had been replanted. This was my neighbor's home, and then a year later their house had been rebuilt. And this is a house on the left that had been destroyed in Atlantic City, and a year later it was being rebuilt. So then the pandemic hits about a year ago, a little over a year ago now. And it was last March, I suddenly, like so many of you, I was unable to travel. I'm usually on the road 8 months out of a year. All of a sudden my life was sort of turned upside down. And, but of course, you know, I have this need to engage with the world. And so I immediately started thinking about, well, if I can't travel, what are the things I can work on to stay engaged with what was the most important story? And so I started to do, like a number of folks, and not only in Seven, but throughout the photographic world, and you know, even beyond the photographic world, people started to keep these sort of visual COVID diaries. I'm just going to show a few images. This is of my wife. Here's a couple of diptychs. This is her doing yoga. And I find this to be really poignant. This is on our street, and within a few days, we held a vigil. This is Julie on the left for a neighbor, our next door neighbor who had died from COVID, and then the birthday party of a 4-year-old neighbor. This was literally just 3 or 4 days apart on the same patch of earth, and this idea of a cycle of life. So one of the major stories I worked on last year at the height of the pandemic, and this was last sort of March to May, June, when New Jersey and New York were really the epicenter at that point of the globe of the pandemic, but particularly in the United States. And as I looked around for what could I do, I decided to focus on a positive story about volunteerism, what I called rising to the call, and looking at all these organizations. This is a local YMCA that had this food drive where they were giving out 40,000 meals a week to people. There were 3-hour long, lines. This is a woman sleeping in her car waiting for food distribution. Blood drives. I wanted to look at all the different ways in this state of the United States, New Jersey, where I live, how are individuals and organizations rising to the call in this terrible pandemic when we were locked down. People were dying, hundreds of people were dying every day just in our midst. This is a local YMCA that was providing free childcare for frontline workers and healthcare workers. And I have to tell you folks, like, I left a lot of these sessions, in tears, but in tears of joy. I was inspired to see how people around me who would I otherwise never know or never come into contact with, we're doing all this extraordinary work that left me feeling, my heart was full. There was hope, and there were so many folks and institutions who are, rising to this moment. These are volunteer emergency medical services. I mean, again, to think about volunteering as an EMS worker, even normal times, is pretty amazing. But to do it when they truly are risking their lives was something extraordinary. There's an elderly Indian man just in the town next to me who had been taken to a hospital. And then you had all these medium and small businesses. This is one of the largest logo manufacturers in America, and he shifted his business to making masks. Local restaurants. This is in Newark, a Cuban restaurant that shifted to making hundreds of meals a day to give out for free to local food banks. This was during Ramadan last year. A local Palestinian organization that banded together, got food donations, and then were creating these care packages for local families. And this is it was a halfway house. This is a halfway house in Paterson, New Jersey, for folks who are suffering from substance abuse and homelessness. And they rose to the occasion and started to take care of COVID patients and handing out food to people. Local farmers, urban and suburban farmers who, again, were growing food to be distributed because there's even today, such a great need. Thankfully, it's changing in the United States, but over the last year, there's been such a great need for food for people. These two women are surgeons, they're bariatric surgeons. So normally, they're booked making probably lots of money doing these elective surgeries. But when COVID hit, excuse me, they couldn't do this kind of surgeries anymore. So instead of going back home, not working, they volunteered in the ICU units of their hospital to take care of COVID patients. So these are highly trained, highly paid surgeons who would normally be making quite a lot of money, and instead they were volunteering. I mean, when you see stories like this, when you meet people like this, you just realize there's so much goodness for all the darkness and all the difficulties that we are experiencing. There are people who are trying to make a difference. This woman is a child psychologist, and normally she works specifically with kids who are in foster care. And normally she would do face-to-face meetings, but because of COVID, she couldn't. So she came up with this way of using these different tools and like dolls to communicate to these kids from the distance she now had to work from. And this is a local therapist who decided to volunteer her time speaking to homebound elders all over the country for free. So I also covered some of the protests last year in the wake of the George Floyd killing, and it really was a time of we felt like a new world order was forming. And while there's still so much to be done when it comes to racial justice and issues around diversity and inclusion, we are making progress. And when I went to these protests, it was incredible to see the people who are out, the different age groups, the complete multicultural society that we have in the United States. This picture was from protest in Newark, New Jersey, which is the largest city in the state of New Jersey. It's a Black city, and I just thought this was so powerful in the midst of this protest march for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many of the other Black folks who've been murdered and killed by the police. This one recent graduate, he's actually an immigrant from Nigeria, just stopped and raised his fist, and he was in his Rutgers University garb. So all right, so the Newest Americans. This is an example of what I call hyperlocal storytelling of global significance. I've been working on this with Julie Winokur, my wife, Tim Raphael, professor at Rutgers University in Newark, which has the most diverse campus in this country. Over 100 languages are spoken. And about 6-7 years ago, we devised this project to basically look at the issue of immigration, but through the lens of the city of Newark and specifically the campus of Rutgers University. So we thought, well, if we can take this campus that is of such great diversity, and Newark, New Jersey, which is a global city, it is full of immigrants, both new and old, including members of the Great Migration, when in the middle of the 20th century, millions of African Americans migrated from the South to the cities of the Northeast and the Midwest and beyond. And so for the last 6+ years, we've been telling different stories in different ways, all focused on immigration. I want to play just like a 2-minute sort of clip or teaser for this project.
We're in the shadows of New York. The thing with the Newark scene is there's so much good talent. It just needs to be recognized. I'm an immigrant, I'm an artist, an organizer, and an instigator.
A lot of their parents don't have cars. They don't have phones. They don't have all these basic things. What's your point?
In my homeland. And my homeland is me. My love for you is fire in my heart. When am I gonna see you free?
Every time I've said I'm going to stop, I can't.
Whenever somebody uses the word illegal, they're actively dehumanizing a person.
Well, Newark was, let's say Newark was a place of entry. If you come from someplace else, you're going to stop in Newark first.
For most of my childhood, my father was all over the world, traveling, speaking, writing poetry, doing plays. Your grandson is now the mayor of the city.
My family is from Pakistan, Egypt, Puerto Rico,
India, Nepal.
I'm the first one in the family to be born in America.
So this project has enabled us to, work on, some of this. That was a really quick teaser. So I know for those of you who haven't seen any of the work, it might not have made sense, but, we did stories on like a Syrian composer who now is, based in the United States, and then worked with an oud player who's a faculty member at Rutgers. We've done stories on reverse migration of Guatemalans who are now returning to Guatemala from the United States. So many different stories. What I want to share is a few and also it's enabled us to work through our partnership with Seven with great photographers like Ashley Gilbertson and Maciek Naberdalek and Tomas van Hoytrev, and of course Ron Haviv. So this has been a great what we call a collaboratory, and it's really a unique collaboration between a university and the faculty members, Talking Eyes Media, the nonprofit production company that Julie runs, and Seven Photo. So we've done the bulk of the photography and the filmmaking. So I want to share a few pieces that I've worked on in the context of this project, again, all locally done. So Julie and I decided to look at, this was actually 4 years ago, the issue of immigrant detention. So I don't know for many of you if you know that something like 90% of the detention facilities in the United States are privately run. That means that there's actually a profit motive to locking up immigrants. The majority, 90% or more, who have done nothing wrong, they've not broken the law other than trying to seek asylum in the United States or come as immigrants. Sorry, I didn't go to sleep. I was just trying to turn the phone off. So we decided to look at this issue through the prism of doing portraits of immigrants who had come to the United States and had been detained anywhere from 6 months to years. Again, they had not broken the law. They were not criminals. So this idea of criminalizing immigration and then having private companies profit from their detention is, for me, despicable. And one of the many ills and evils in this country that we need to address. And so we photographed a number of these folks and then did interviews with them. And we did an exhibition in the city of Newark where we had life-size prints with a barcode next to the print. And if you photograph that, if you scan that, then you would get a call back from these individuals telling their story. So we've experimented also in the course of this project, Newest Americans, with a number of different approaches to visual storytelling. We also worked on a piece called 37 Voices, and it was looking at basically the working poor in this state. And we focused on a number of domestic workers. This is Ursula, she's from Brazil, and she's a house cleaner. She's 50 years old. She's raised 2 kids. All the while, this is at one of her son's birthday parties in Newark. All the while, kind of basically skirting the poverty line. And it's this idea of it's how can it be okay in a society if people are working hard, working full time, and are still living in poverty or near poverty? And I know poverty is a tricky one. It's somewhat in the eye of the beholder. There are statistical, benchmarks that determine it. But what we found. So this is this woman, Marciela. She's from Mexico. She's incredible to me. She represents the best of the folks who immigrate to America. She now has her own house cleaning business in the middle of New Jersey, and she employs 6 other women. So not only is she working hard, raising a family as a single mom, she has 3 kids, but she is also employing other people. This is a woman from Guatemala. She suffered tremendous domestic abuse and back at her home country. And now she's here. She's worked as a horse trainer. She's worked as a house cleaner, babysitter. Again, these these folks, what we see here is they're working so hard to make ends meet and pretty much doing everything right. This picture means a lot to me. One of the things she does for one of her clients is darn their clothing, you know, to as a seamstress. And so she was just sort of trying this on to see how her work had gone. So as I say, there's so many rich stories to be told if you just, whether you look, you know, in your house or just within, you know, as I like to say, within a few square miles of where you live. Now, this woman is from Nepal. She's also a poet. She was working on one of her poems here. She is also a domestic worker. Here she's doing puja early in the morning before she sets out to work. And this is in Jersey City, where she is working. She's very involved in a workers' alliance to promote better labor practices for domestic workers in the state of New Jersey and also in the United States in general. And here she was having a meeting with a number of other workers and labor organizers. Coming home late from work. And then another project I worked on last year was looking at the one city of Freehold, New Jersey. It's a small town. It's actually where Bruce Springsteen comes from. I didn't know that when I began this project, but it's now probably of a town of 10,000 people, half or more are immigrants, mostly Latinx. And so we wanted to look at, I worked with Marianne Peruth, a wonderful writer, an Indian woman, also an immigrant to this country. By the way, I'm a first-generation American. My parents came from Iraq, from Baghdad in 1942. So I also, in my own personal story, am connected to these kinds of stories. And so what we wanted to do was look at the impact of the pandemic on this one community of immigrant laborers, because the Latinx community in particular has been hit very hard by the pandemic. So we did a number of interviews and portraits, also went to the site in the middle of town where they congregate, the day laborers congregate to get work. This is Rita Dentino. She's this incredible activist and immigrant rights activist. It's just, again, you know, you get to realize how many incredible people are in your midst doing all these wonderful things that you otherwise would never learn about. This story was eventually published in The Nation magazine. And you know, I've been fortunate that most of the stories I've been working on the pandemic have appeared in, you know, the New York Times, The Nation, or other major media. So again, this idea of having impact with one's work, you know, getting the message out there is also very important to me. And because of the pandemic, you know, originally I with Marianne, you know, my goal was to, you know, find a few workers and then spend lots of time with them. And what became clear very quickly was that nobody really wanted a photographer and a writer to be hanging out in the midst of this pandemic in their homes. So we sort of shifted gears and decided to approach it as a portrait with, you know, interview and testimony approach. Many of these laborers, like this gentleman, he got COVID. Thankfully, he recovered, but then nobody wanted to hire him to work, and even his housemates kind of shunned him. Some of these folks have been here for 30 years, 40 years. And again, they often congregate the day laborers on the railroad track through the middle of Freehold, waiting to be picked up to get work for that day. And the last thing I want to share with you here is, and this is an upcoming a new development from the Newest Americans project. And we're creating what we're calling the Newark Story Bus. And so we were able to get an NEH grant, National Endowment for the Humanities, a very large grant over a 2-year period, so that we could not only continue the Newest Americans project, but create this story bus. So this bus, let's see if this will play. So we hired these two great local artists. Actually, they live in Brooklyn, and to paint this bust that we acquired. And basically, it will be a media lab, a roving media lab, where one part of it will be a photo studio and one part of it will be an audio recording studio. And the idea will be that hopefully, as the pandemic lifts and the weather gets better, these pictures were taken a couple months ago in upstate New York, so it was still snowing. Great artist is fabricating the interior of this bus in her upstate New York farm, on her farm. But ultimately, this bus will go around the city of Newark and not only have the content we've created over the last 6 years to share with local community members, but also invite them to come in to this vehicle and get photographed and also to share their stories, so that we, over time, will, the goal of this story bus is to capture and archive the stories of people from Newark today. So that's it for my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing and welcome back to the real Zoom world here. And
great, thanks, thanks. Ed. Let's see, we have some questions. Let's have a look at what we've got. So a question from Julio Alberin, how do you decide what stories to cover? Even when you're working locally, there's still an incredible variety of things. Do you have, a way of, how do you approach a story? How do you know it's a good story? Is it a kind of gut feeling? Is it through research? What's your thought process in terms of identifying the projects you want to work on?
So thank you for that question. So, for me, I work a lot from the gut, and it's partly the mania of the need. And Paul, I know you know this, and I'm sure folks out there know this, where, I can't help but do this work. It's what keeps me alive and keeps me moving forward. So at any given moment, I'm always sort of charting and researching what's out there, what themes, what issues are out there. And then I respond to what connects to me, not just intellectually, not just as a journalist or a reporter or an anthropologist, of course, on that level, but also at that sort of heart and gut level. And then, of course, evaluating, well, can I do that story? Am I the right person to do it? Am I able to do it? Generally security issues aren't going to be a factor domestically for the most part, but it's really those factors that go into my decision making on what stories I decide to tell. Because one thing I've also learned as a mentor and teacher is people often get tripped up at this point in their process, where they have so many ideas they want to do, and there's so many things that interest them that they can never settle down and commit to one. And I can't emphasize this enough. Part of doing this work effectively is being able to commit to something. That means there will always be stories you'd love to do that you won't get to, but at least you will get to one story or a few stories at a time so that you can accomplish something.
And then once you've decided, how do you, another question here from Effie Damon in the Netherlands, how do you actually go about finding people then? Do you have a sort of an approach that you found effective? Do you do it through just wandering the streets, or through organizations or social media or gatekeepers, or is it different on every project?
All of the above. But I would say, like, so just as a concrete example with the Rising to the Call project, that was a case where there were a few news articles at that point about, whatever, a local company diverts, like a liquor distillery company decides to make disinfectant, or a seamstress decides to make masks. So we basically just did, just good solid journalism of reporting. And Brenda Bingham, who works with me, my studio manager, but beyond that, she's just incredible. I basically worked with her and she was working in the role of a producer. So whether you can do it yourself, or you have a writer you work with, or an editor or a producer, that is how I did that story, where then we just cast a wide net using the internet and doing research every day. What were new things going on, We'd see a story about, a local county sheriff's department has decided to disinfect all the vehicles of healthcare workers at a local hospital. Great story. So we reach out to the sheriff's department, we reach out to the hospital, and it's just basic reporting, really, where you find a story, or you find an idea, and then you do the due diligence of contacting, again, whether it's an individual, a company, a governmental organization, a hospital, an institution, and then, hopefully getting permission to gain access. Now, there were some things I wanted to do, like in hospitals, that especially back then, a year ago, I couldn't get access to because, and understandably so, they needed to focus their energies in these hospitals and these healthcare facilities on combating the pandemic, not on, using staff time to bring a photographer around. But that's basically the approach. Some stories you don't need to go through official channels. It's really just a matter of contacting an individual or a family. And for other stories, you need to go through the hoops of gaining, more formal access.
And how persistent are you? We have a question from Mark Bolton, who says he's working on a similar kind of project with a hospital. He's reached out to them, but he just hasn't got a response. How persistent are you, and when do you realize, what's the point at which you give up and move on to something else?
Yeah, well, you have to be persistent, and it's one of the great talents you need to do this work, because that not only goes for finding subjects to gain access and all that, it even goes for getting work and making contact with potential clients, for lack of a better term. That we need to perfect the ability to be persistent but not annoying. Because when you hit that point, that inflection point where you become annoying, whether it's to a client or to a subject, then usually you are not going to succeed. So I'm persistent. Sometimes with Brenda, I'll play good cop, bad cop. Obviously she's the good cop. But there is a point at times, like with one of the local hospitals, and this was really interesting, where they just kept on deferring. They wouldn't give me an answer. They didn't say no, but they didn't say yes. Literally, I think like more than a month had gone by, and then I had shown the work I had done at that point to an editor at the New York Times, and he thankfully said, we want to do this. But I said to him, I'm not finished. So now I was able to revert back to the hospital and other upcoming subjects that we wanted to cover. And then I was able to say, I'm doing this with the New York Times. And then voila, all of a sudden the hospital opened up. So, you've got to use whatever you can for leverage. But I totally understand if you are working independently, you have no media backing or NGO or foundation backing you, that it definitely can be tough. And there is a point where you have to realize, especially with bigger institutions and especially with healthcare facilities, that it just might not be possible. So one of the ways you can get around that, and again, in the particular case, I can't remember the name of the gentleman who asked this question, I think Mark, but anyway, you might need to devise a different approach. Maybe you intended to get into the, the under the belly of the beast, the ICU units, or to be able to photograph patients. And maybe what you'll realize is that the best you can do is get maybe the healthcare workers to agree to come and meet you outside of the hospital to do portraits and interviews with them. Now, maybe that might not at all satisfy what your initial intention is or was, but sometimes we need to rally and figure out a different approach instead of just giving up.
So you answered a couple of questions that were in the pipeline there as well, about how to kind of be persistent and working with how valuable it is to have a publication to help open those doors. But obviously something else that's very much part of this when you start working with somebody is that kind of process of how you actually begin the relationship and how you set out what that relationship is going to be. So things like informed consent, do you start off by just getting to know the person before you start shooting? Or is that a kind of case by case? So just how you build that relationship, and how much time would you spend with somebody typically? Obviously, again, it's a bit of an open-ended question, but in an ideal world, what's a kind of sweet spot, if you like, of how long you could be with somebody to get this kind of depth of intimacy without spending, you know, months and months and months, if that makes sense. So quite a few different questions there, but essentially around navigating that relationship with individual people, consent, you know, do you tell them who you're working for, who the publication is going to be, and things like that?
Yeah. So, you know, I welcome this new conversation, I'd say in the last 5 years or so, of this term informed consent, because it is a critically important and relatively new element within the way we must work, quite frankly, and the way we should always have worked, but the way we must work now. So, I mean, for me, informed consent is, well, on the most human basic level, is that you've explained, and I always say this, you need to be able to say who you are, what you're doing, why you're doing it, if it's relevant, who you're doing it for or with, and what will happen to the work. You need to be able to answer those questions concisely and clearly to potential subjects, because at least then you are being transparent on who you are and what you're doing, and, you know, why. And quite often the why is what will hook people, you know, because if you're being sincere, and, you know, if your idea is not just relevant, but you know, heartfelt, like in the case of the Latinx workers in this town of Freehold, you know, we were clear that we were coming to tell their story because we see that they are frontline workers who are taking extraordinary risks and have virtually no support, no health care, no workman's comp, no unemployment insurance, and yet they continue to go out there and work and get sick, and sadly in some cases die. So when people see that you understand their dilemma, you understand their situation, that they then will generally open up more and accept you, and then become what I consider willing collaborators. Now, in the amount of time that I spend with people, that's not a tricky bit, but it's definitely something that I feel has changed over time, even pre-pandemic, but especially since the pandemic. And as I outlined earlier, with the Freehold story on Latinx workers, where my intention was to do the classic, you know, deep dive documentary work. I want to photograph everyone in your family, at work, at home, at play, at church, whatever it is. And then you quickly realize, like, they'll let you onto their porch, or they'll maybe let you into like a room in their house. Maybe they'll spend an hour or two with you, and then that's it. They're done. And so, as disappointing or frustrating as that may be, there is no alternative. I mean, yeah, we can slightly push people, but I'm increasingly feeling like I don't want to be photographing people, especially in stories like this, who I don't want to make them uncomfortable or unhappy or feel violated or put out. And it's another tricky kind of tightrope that you have to traverse in doing this work, because there are absolutely times where we need to inconvenience people to do the work we want to do, you know. But increasingly, I'm of the heart of that. I'm trying to avoid that, because, well, it's just not a good feeling, you know. And so you need to weigh, you know, the importance, the relevance, the potential impact of pushing harder and maybe inconveniencing people. You need to weigh that to what is the potential impact of the work I'm doing. I hope that answered your questions. I'm happy if you have a follow-up.
Again, I'm amalgamating several questions here together, but there's quite a few people interested in how you think about the visual strategy that you're going to use for a particular project and how much that's changed over time. So, obviously black and white versus color, medium format versus 35mm, when to use video, and then when you are going to use video, you've been quite innovative in mixing stills and video together and jump cuts and things like that. So how does that process work in terms of working out the right visual strategy? Is it organic?
Yeah. Did we lose Paul? I hope not.
I muted myself by mistake.
Right.
Did you get the question there? Sorry.
You prematurely muted. Okay. first, the big one at this point, because I do so much video work now. I do so much work as a filmmaker, not as a still photographer. And so the probably the most important first decision on visual strategy, and I know visual strategy is not a sexy term or a poetic term, but boy, it sure captures the point, which is when we begin something, we must have intention, we must have clarity of purpose. And so, for me, the first decision is, am I going to make a film or am I going to make a series of images, whether they're a portrait series or a photo essay or some amalgam of those approaches as a still photographer, or am I going to do both? And so once I decide that, then a lot gets determined. If I decide I'm only going to be working as a filmmaker, well, then I don't need to wear the hat of a still photographer. I don't need to think about, what I need to do. And quite frankly, working as a filmmaker is a lot harder because you do need access. You can't just have a 1-hour portrait session and interview with someone. That will achieve nothing, not nothing, but it will not give you the raw material you need to actually make a film, even a short film. I mean, unless you just want it to be a talking head with no visual element. So on the other hand, as I have shown and reflected in the work I shared with you today, I decided during the pandemic on these local stories to work as a still photographer because I felt that it was, it just made so much sense on so many levels. The amount of time I would need with my subjects, the ability to make something powerful without draining my subjects and inconveniencing them during a pandemic. And then also the idea of dissemination of the work. What's the impact that the work can have? And I still deeply believe in the power of a great environmental portrait with testimony, with the voices of your subjects. So again, there's the visual strategy, is it filmmaking? Is it still photography? Is it a mixture in terms of still photography? Then is it portraits or is it reportage or some combination? I'm sure maybe some of you have other ideas of how you would approach it visually. And I'm totally open to more kind of inventive and creative ways of approaching visual storytelling, folks. So please, I'm just giving you basic outlines of visual strategies, but my God, you can do so much now, and especially creating, social media pieces and Instagram stories and, integrating text and drawings and whatever it is, whatever you want to do. To me, the sky is the limit, and we've never been in a position where we have so many creative tools at our fingertips to utilize to tell stories. And I look at the work of other photographers now that are working, and so many are doing just such great work in this moment, from the hardcore, unflinching, black and white, journalistic work. I mean, Ashley Gilbertson's work about New York City on the pandemic, boy, that sticks with me deeply. Philip Montgomery and a number of other great photographers that are doing really hardcore frontline work. And then there's all this beautiful work being done by, I think of Rosa Morton, who's a nurse, but she's also a wonderful young photojournalist. And she did a story about herself as a nurse during the pandemic in a hospital. So there's so many different ways, as I say, to skin this cat. And I'm happy to brainstorm with you or any of you guys here in this space if you want. But for me, I think I've outlined my approaches, and I hope I've outlined my thinking and how I go about making those decisions. And I have one more thing I want to add to it is, when thinking of output and dissemination, I'm cognizant of the fact that if I decide to do a short documentary film, then that will close out like a whole range of potential outlets to distribute the work through, but it will then open up a whole range of media outlets that otherwise might not be interested in the work, and it goes the same for doing only stills.
Do you think, after another interesting question, after spending a year shooting Hyperlocal, if and when things open up again, do you think you'll kind of be desperate to just go out and shoot other stories around the world, or would you try to keep this hyper-local approach? It's an interesting thing, in other words, what's your response going to be post pandemic, assuming there ever is a post pandemic, of course.
So yeah, no, it's true. It's not something to actually laugh at. Well, just for clarity here, in the past year, I've also worked in Rwanda, and I've worked throughout the United States on different other projects. So I've continued to travel, just not at the pace that I normally travel. And also what's happened is I've had many projects either postponed or unfortunately killed that would have sent me around the world, around the country to work. So in the course of this last year, I have continued to work and travel, just to be clear, and I fully intend to continue to do that. I'm leaving this Sunday for Los Angeles to work on a film for the next week. So I think to answer your question, candidly and accurately, is that in the same way that I have been working both locally and internationally for the past 20 years or so, I hope to continue to do both of those approaches, because there is something, as I say, there was a period of my life, it's probably in my 30s, definitely in my 30s and in my 40s, where there was that sense of, I have to go to Iraq, I have to go to Afghanistan, I have to go to Nigeria, I have to go to, these places, where I was keenly and genuinely interested in stories, but then I thought, but then when like I'd have an assignment in the United States, I'd be like, oh, not that this is boring, but, I somehow, it didn't feel the same. Well, that's all gone now. And I'm happy to say, or not happy, but I love that this has happened within me, at least, that I can go around the block and I can still bring the same sense of, open heart, open mind, like, what am I going to see today? What am I going to discover? Who am I going to meet? What story is going to unfold in front of me? And quite frankly, I know that some of you will not believe this, but some, like, New Jersey can be as exotic as Rwanda on some level. And exotic is a lame word. I'm actually sorry I even used that word. Erase that one. What I'm saying is not exotic, but can make you feel like you've been transported somewhere else. That's really what I mean. Yeah,
amazing. How do you think people are going to look back on this pandemic period, in terms of photography and in terms of the importance of it? Is it, in 20, 30 years time, how important do you think it is in comparison to other things we've lived through, other situations we've experienced?
I know, it's an interesting question, Paul. I've started to compile articles and like books that were written about the pandemic 100 years ago, because if I could find some time, I'd like to kind of get a sense of what was written, how it was characterized then and sort of historically contextualized, because I'm sure that there will be yard markers that back then that will give us some idea of what we're in for now, post-pandemic. Like, will there be another roaring 20s? But will there be another stock market crash in 2029? But anyway, I'll tell you that on a visual level, the whole like mask wearing thing has presented, I don't know if this is exactly answering the question, but it's presented a bit of a conundrum. Over the past year, when I've worked on projects that are not related to the pandemic, there's been this conscious kind of, like need to sort of, some cases to say to someone, can you please take your mask off, as long as it was in a safe environment, of course, and they were willing, because I knew that, or we knew the work, what we were creating is not meant to be about the pandemic, and that if people have masks on, then it really sort of places it within a kind of constrained time period. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, of course. It's also honest and true. But, in some kinds of stories, like next week, we're going to LA to do a film for UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles, about diversity in their sciences. And so this is not a film this is not a film that should appear to be done during the pandemic. But we have no idea. We might go into these labs with these students and they might be like, we're not taking our mask off. Well, then so be it. That's how it'll be. But in terms of how I think the broader question, or the spirit of the question you asked, I think people will see this time as a pretty hard and rough period, even if you've been fortunate enough to skirt the disease itself, and your loved ones and your friends and your coworkers, that you know, even if you haven't been, you know, intimately hurt or damaged by loss from the pandemic, it will still be a period of, I think, a period that will feel kind of dark and difficult. But I also think that many people will feel gratitude for things that they otherwise wouldn't have recognized, you know, because in the sort of frenetic lives we live, most of us live, it seems, in this modern world we're in, you know, things happen so quickly and there's such a turnover of experience and information, and with social media, that we often don't stop enough to kind of take stock of not only who we are, but who is around us. You know, like for instance, in the past year, I've spent more time with Julie than we have in the previous 28 years of our relationship. And for us, it's been like a reawakening of our relationship in terms of appreciating each other and learning to work even better with each other and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, I'm not saying it's all good, but, you know, so I guess to answer the question, I think people will look back on it in a variety of ways. But I think one thing we will all agree upon is, when it's over, is thank goodness it's over, and we can go out again and we can hug each other and we can shake hands and we can kiss and we can talk with each other and not have to have masks on in each other's homes and all of those kinds of things. That was a long answer.
Yeah, there's a joke about in a couple of years' time, we'll put a hand in a pocket of a jacket we haven't worn for a while and pull a mask out and think, oh, remember those times, as we then put on our hazmat suit and our full, you know, sort of get into a vacuum sealed vehicle and go out because it's got even worse. But anyway, we're going to end on one last question or set of questions, which is obviously we get a lot, which is, what advice would you give to your younger self, as it were, if you were starting out in photography now? But I think just to keep it focused on this, you know, what 2 or 3 pieces of advice would you give how you could use this kind of hyperlocal storytelling? Because often people, when they're starting out in their careers, they think they have to go and tell some extraordinary story in a faraway land in order to be able to break into the industry. What lessons do you think you can pull from your experience, particularly recently, of doing the hyperlocal stories, that you could give people who are beginning their careers as how to produce compelling work from these sort of situations? Yeah,
it's such a great question and an important question. And I don't know of the 100+ people who are on this, you know, where you all are, but, you know, one of the beautiful things that is transpired or evolved in the last, again, 5 years particular, but, you know, started maybe a little longer than that, is more of not a regionalization of work, but, you know, that now people in, you know, in Africa and in Asia and Latin America and the subcontinent, all over the world, that you've never had access, you never had the ability to have access more than you do now to storytelling and getting your work out there. Part of that is a function of social media. Part of that is the media has changed. And I know this from experience, where, you know, editors will now much rather, you know, find a photographer in Nigeria than send me to Nigeria, that kind of a thing. So while, you know, boohoo for me, because I still love going to those places, I totally understand why. So the point being that wherever you are in the world, there are great stories to be told. And more than ever, people are interested. They want to know. They want to know what's going on in your backyard, maybe what's going on in your home, maybe even in your bedroom, like in your room, what is going on. And so don't feel you need to take crazy chances and go to conflict zones or whatever it may be to get ahead, right? The most important thing is that you tell a story you really care about and that you commit to it, and you're patient with yourself and you're patient with the story, and you give it time to evolve, and you give yourself a chance to experiment with your approach, your visual approach, and work on it for a while, months if not years. And then if you've created this great body of work, I promise you good things will come from it. I promise you. And it does, and then it won't matter whether you did it, of your neighbor in Iowa or Botswana or wherever, or whether you traveled halfway around the globe, And I hope that is not a lesson, but I hope that's a message you all, for those of you that it's relevant, that you'll take, is that, don't think that because you're doing something that is familiar, telling a story about someone or something that is familiar to you or that is near you, that it's not relevant to other people. I think that's the biggest takeaway I hope you'll take from this is, believe in your instincts, believe in the stories and the people around you. I think we're really hungry for stories about other folks. And again, to finish on this, what's so beautiful now is that increasingly people can tell the stories of their own people and their own places and then share it with the world.
And that's been the real lesson from the pandemic, because there've been so many amazing bodies of work that fit exactly the criteria that you just outlined, because people by necessity have had to turn their attention on their own environment. And it's incredible, the outpouring of creativity, emotional and psychological storytelling that's happened. I've said quite a few times now, but the pandemic obviously has been this global event that's affected everybody. But in the history of photography, it's a unique event, because practically everybody that has a camera, and I'm using the term camera very loosely to include phones and so on, has turned it in some way on their own life. And I think people should take great heart from that, because I've seen so many amazing projects that people have shot, as you said, literally inside their own four walls, never mind on their street or whatever it might be. And I think it's very encouraging how amazing those projects have been, what incredible variety, and also how successful they've been. Yeah. So as always, Ed, it's been,
Paul,
sorry, go on.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say it really outlines how much incredible talent there is out in the world.
Absolutely.
And how much love there is for photography. Mm-hmm. That this is not a dying medium. This is
and also how much a lot of that, with things like Instagram, we've been able to communicate, almost unmediated without having to go through a major media organization or a gallery or an art gallery or whatever it might be. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, as always, Ed, it's fantastic to spend time with you. It's such a rich and deep thinker about the medium of storytelling and documentary, and a great pleasure to have hosted you again today. Thank you very much to the audience and for so many great questions and great feedback. Once again, thanks to PhotoWings, our partner, for helping us make these happen. And a huge thank you to Seven Insider. Keep coming back. It's fantastic to see lots of familiar faces, or I should see familiar names, but they're becoming part of our crew, which is wonderful. I'm so happy, as a group, we're so happy that the feedback from these sessions has been so positive, and really great that we have your support. So thank you very much, Ed. Thanks again, Gianna, behind the scenes as well. And see you at the next one. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.